I found out that the $55,000 I sent my mother to pay off the house she spent on her lover. Now she declared, "The bank is demanding the repayment of loan debts. Now this is your problem." I refused, and she started spreading rumors about me. The next day, my phone was flooded with messages from relatives blaming me for everything, so I just smiled and blocked them all. So here I am, 32 years old, living my own life after my parents' messy divorce about 5 years back. My name's Michael, and like most guys my age, I was just trying to figure out this whole adulting thing while helping out family when I could. My mom stayed in the family house after the split, and honestly, I felt bad for her. Dad took off to Florida with his new girlfriend, leaving Mom to deal with everything alone. Being the decent son I thought I started helping with the mortgage payments. Not the full amount, mind you, but a solid chunk every month. We're talking about $1,500 that I could have been using for my own apartment upgrade, or maybe finally getting that pickup truck I'd been eyeing. But family comes first, right? That's what I kept telling myself every time I transferred that money. Mom never really thanked me outright, but I figured that's just how she was. She'd grown up during tougher times when people didn't throw around thank yous like confetti at a parade. For 3 years, this routine continued. Every month, like clockwork, I'd send that payment. My friends thought I was crazy, especially when I had to skip guys' trips to Vegas or couldn't afford to upgrade my car. But I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing, keeping Mom's house safe from foreclosure. Then came that Tuesday evening in March that changed everything. Mom called me around 7, which was weird because she usually texted. Her voice sounded different, kind of shaky, like when she used to call the school to report me sick, when I wasn't actually sick. She asked me to come over immediately for a serious conversation. The way she said it made my stomach drop. You know that feeling when you're driving and suddenly see cop lights in your rearview mirror? That's exactly what hit me. I drove over to the house, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe she was sick. Maybe there was a problem with the house. Maybe Dad had done something stupid. The 20-minute drive felt like hours, and I kept checking my phone at red lights, hoping for some hint about what this was about. When I got there, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. Her face looked pale, and she had that expression she used to get when she was about to deliver bad news, like when our dog Max got hit by that delivery truck when I was 12. She gestured for me to sit down across from her, and that's when she dropped the bomb. The bank was demanding immediate payment on multiple credit accounts that were seriously behind. We're not talking about a missed payment or two. These were months of unpaid bills, and the amounts were staggering. My first reaction was confusion. How could there be credit problems when I'd been helping with the house payments? The mortgage should have been current. But as she started explaining, nothing made sense. She kept mentioning these debts like I should have known about them all along. That's when she said the words that still echo in my head today. She looked me straight in the eyes and told me that these debts were now my problem to solve. Not a request for help, not asking if I could assist. She stated it as a fact, like she was telling me the sky was blue or that water was wet. I sat there completely speechless. My brain couldn't process what she was saying. Here I was, this guy who'd been sacrificing his own financial goals for years to help her, and suddenly I'm being told that I'm responsible for debts I never knew existed. The papers she showed me revealed credit card balances, personal loans, and other financial obligations that totaled more than my entire annual salary. The numbers were absolutely insane. I'm talking about the kind of debt that takes decades to pay off, the kind that ruins credit scores and keeps people awake at night. What made it worse was how she presented it. There was no apology, no explanation of how things had gotten so bad, no acknowledgement of the help I'd already been providing. It was just this cold statement that I needed to fix everything. I tried to ask questions about how this had happened, but her answers were vague and defensive. She kept saying things had been difficult since the divorce, that expenses had piled up, that she tried her best to manage everything alone. But none of it explained the massive amounts of debt she'd accumulated. The whole situation felt surreal, like I was living in some twisted version of reality, where helping someone automatically made you responsible for all their problems. I kept thinking about all those months I'd sent money, believing I was helping with legitimate house expenses. As I drove home that night, My hands were literally shaking on the steering wheel. I couldn't wrap my head around what had just happened. Part of me wondered if this was some kind of test, or if there was something I wasn't understanding correctly. But deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong with this picture. The mom I thought I knew, the one I'd been helping for years, had just blindsided me with a financial disaster that could destroy my own future. And she presented it like it was my fault for not knowing about it sooner. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how someone could accumulate that much debt without their family knowing. Where had all that money gone? Why hadn't she mentioned any financial problems when I was sending those monthly payments? The worst part was the realization that everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my mom might have been completely wrong. Was I just a convenient source of money to her? Had she been planning this moment for months, waiting until the situation became desperate enough to dump it all on me? I had no idea that this was just the beginning, and that the real truth about where my money had been going was about to make everything 10 times worse. After that bombshell conversation, I couldn't just sit around waiting for answers. Something about the whole situation smelled fishy, and my gut was telling me there was more to this story than Mom was letting on. The next few days were torture. I kept replaying our conversation, trying to make sense of how someone could rack up that much debt without any warning signs. I mean, I'm not some financial expert, but I'm not completely clueless either. How do you hide that level of financial disaster from your own family? I decided to do some detective work. Since I'd been helping with payments for years, I figured I had a right to understand where my money had actually been going. I started by looking at my own bank records, tracking every transfer I'd made to Mom over the past 3 years. The numbers were eye-opening. I'd sent her over $54,000 during that time. That's not pocket change. That a brand new truck, or a down payment on a nice house, or my entire emergency fund plus some. Money that I'd earned working overtime, skipping vacations, and living in a cramped apartment instead of upgrading. But here's where things got really interesting. I managed to sweet-talk my way into getting some information about the mortgage payments. Turns out, the house payments have been spotty at best over the past year and a half. Some months nothing went through, other months only partial payments. So where the hell had my money been going? I was sending $1,500 a month religiously, but it wasn't reaching the mortgage company. That realization hit me like a freight train. All those sacrifices I'd made, all those times I'd told myself I was being a good son, and the money was just disappearing into thin air. That's when I started digging deeper into public records and anything else I could find. What I discovered made my blood run cold. There were records of frequent transactions at upscale restaurants, luxury retail stores, and even a couple of weekend getaway trips. None of this matched the struggling single mom story I'd been hearing for years. The spending patterns were wild. We're talking about 5-star restaurants, designer boutiques, spa treatments, and hotel stays that cost more per night than most people spend on rent. This wasn't someone barely scraping by. This was someone living it up while I was eating ramen noodles to afford my monthly contributions. But the real kicker came when I stumbled across something that made everything click into place. I was helping Mom with some computer issues a few days later, and she stepped away to take a phone call. Her email was still open on the screen, and I couldn't help but notice some message threads that caught my attention. There were dozens of emails with someone named Tyler. The timestamp showed these conversations had been going on for over 2 years. At first glance, they looked innocent enough, but something about the tone made me keep reading. Big mistake, or maybe the best mistake I ever made. The emails revealed a relationship that went way beyond friendship. This Tyler guy was clearly more than just a casual acquaintance. The messages were flirty, intimate, and worst of all, they talked about money. A lot of money. My money, as it turned out. One email thread from about 6 months earlier made me want to punch a hole through the wall. Tyler was talking about some expensive weekend trip they'd taken, and Mom was worried about the cost. His response was something along the lines of not worrying, because her son was reliable and would cover any financial gaps. Another message chain showed Tyler, encouraging Mom to not stress about mortgage payments, because family members always step up when things get tough. He actually used a phrase that I should consider it an investment in her happiness. The audacity of this complete stranger making financial decisions about my life was beyond infuriating. But wait, it gets worse. I found evidence that Tyler had been actively coaching Mom on how to ask family members for money. There were draft messages that he'd helped her write, strategies for making her situation sound more desperate than it actually was, and even suggestions for emotional manipulation tactics. The most sickening part was discovering that Tyler wasn't some broke loser taking advantage of a lonely woman. This guy had his own money. He owned a small business and drove a car that cost more than I make in 2 years. He wasn't using Mom for financial support. He was using her to access my financial support. Reading through months of these emails was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Every romantic dinner I'd unknowingly paid for, every romantic getaway funded by my overtime hours, every expensive gift that I made possible while eating generic cereal for breakfast. The timeline became crystal clear. Tyler had entered the picture about 2.5 years ago, right around when Mom's spending had started getting out of control. The fancy restaurants, the shopping sprees, the weekend trips. It was all part of the relationship that I'd been unknowingly bankrolling. What made it even worse was realizing that Tyler had probably been the one suggesting that Mom should get more money from her family. The debt crisis wasn't just bad financial management. It was a result of someone deliberately encouraging overspending while knowing that family members would eventually be pressured to clean up the mess. I felt physically sick reading these messages. Every time I'd skip going out with friends to save money for Mom's house payment, Tyler and Mom had been living it up on my dime. Every time I'd chosen store-brand groceries over name brand to stretch my budget, they'd been dining at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than my entire weekly food budget. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about years of lies, manipulation, and taking advantage of my genuine desire to help family. I'd been played like a complete fool by my own mother, and some guy I'd never even heard of until now. But here's the part that really twisted the knife. In one of the more recent emails, Tyler was giving Mom advice about the debt situation. He suggested that she should make it sound like a family emergency and emphasize how much she'd sacrificed over the years as a single mother. He literally coached her on emotional manipulation tactics to use on her own children. The conversation I'd had with Mom just days earlier wasn't a desperate plea for help from a struggling parent. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to make me feel guilty enough to take on massive financial responsibility for their lifestyle choices. As I sat there staring at the computer screen, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my mom was a complete lie. The woman I'd been trying to help for years had been systematically deceiving me while living a double life funded by my sacrifices. You'd think discovering the truth would be the worst part of this whole mess, but I was dead wrong. The real nightmare was just getting started, and it came wearing the faces of people I'd trusted my entire life. Within days of my confrontation with Mom about Tyler and the money trail, my phone started blowing up. First, it was my sister Jessica calling from Denver, then my brother Mark from Phoenix. Somehow, word had gotten out to the entire family network, and I was about to become public enemy number 1. The family meeting was scheduled for that Saturday at Mom's house. When I walked in, it felt like stepping into a courtroom where everyone had already decided I was guilty. Jessica and Mark were sitting on the couch with their arms crossed, wearing identical expressions of disappointment and anger. Mom was in her favorite chair, looking small and fragile in that way she perfected over the years. Even my Uncle Dave had driven down from Sacramento, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't going to be a reasonable family discussion. Uncle Dave only showed up when there was serious drama or someone was getting married. Since nobody was engaged, I knew I was about to get railroaded. The conversation started civil enough, but it didn't stay that way for long. Jessica kicked things off by explaining how shocked and hurt she was to learn that I'd been abandoning Mom during her time of greatest need. According to her version of events, I was some kind of heartless son who'd turn his back on family when the going got tough. Mark jumped in with his own speech about family loyalty and how disappointed Dad would be if he knew what kind of man I'd become. The irony of Mark lecturing me about family loyalty wasn't lost on me. considering he'd visited Mom exactly twice in the past 2 years and had never contributed a single penny to any family expenses. But here's what really got under my skin. Every single person in that room knew I'd been sending money to Mom for years. They'd all benefited from me taking care of her financial needs because it meant they didn't have to. Yet somehow, I was the villain for discovering that my money had been funding her secret relationship instead of helping with legitimate expenses. Uncle Dave, bless his heart, tried to play mediator at first. He suggested that maybe we could all contribute something to help Mom through this difficult time. The suggestion lasted about 30 seconds before Jessica shut it down, explaining that she and her husband were already stretched thin with their kids' college expenses and couldn't possibly take on additional financial burdens. Mark had an even better excuse. His contracting business was going through a slow period, and he was worried about making his own mortgage payments. Of course, this didn't stop him from showing up in a brand new Ford F-150 that probably cost more than Mom's entire debt situation. But apparently that was different because it was a business expense. The whole thing turned into this twisted logic where everyone acknowledged that Mom needed help. Everyone agreed that families should support each other, but somehow I was the only family member with actual financial responsibility. The math didn't add up, but nobody seemed interested in addressing that particular elephant in the room. What really pushed me over the edge was when Mom started crying. Not real tears, mind you, but that fake crying she perfected when I was a teenager and she wanted to feel guilty about something. She started talking about how hard it had been to manage everything alone after the divorce, how she'd sacrificed so much for her children over the years, and how devastating it was to realize that her own son would abandon her. The performance was Oscar-worthy. I'll give her that. She managed to make herself sound like this tragic figure who'd been victimized by circumstances beyond her control. There was no mention of Tyler, no acknowledgement of the luxury spending, no recognition of the years of financial support I'd already provided. Just pure, manipulative victim theater designed to make everyone in the room see me as the bad guy. Jessica bought into it completely. She started getting emotional, talking about how Mom had always been there for us kids and how this was our chance to return the favor. She painted this picture of Mom as this self-sacrificing saint who deserved better from her ungrateful children. The fact that I was the only child who'd actually been providing financial support for years somehow got completely lost in the narrative. Mark joined in with his own version of the guilt trip, focusing on what kind of example I was setting for the next generation of the family. According to his logic, my refusal to take on Mom's debts was going to teach our kids that family doesn't matter and that you should abandon your parents when they need you most. The whole thing was like being in an alternate reality where facts didn't matter and emotional manipulation was considered a valid argument. I tried explaining about Tyler, about the restaurant receipts, about the emails I discovered, but every piece of evidence I presented was dismissed or twisted into something else. When I showed them proof of the expensive dinners and weekend trips, Jessica suggested that Mom deserved to have some happiness in her life after years of loneliness. When I explained about Tyler coaching Mom on how to ask for money, Mark said I was being paranoid and looking for excuses to avoid family responsibility. Uncle Dave, who I'd hoped might be voice of reason, eventually sided with the majority. He gave me this disappointed look and started talking about how his generation understood family loyalty in ways that younger people apparently didn't. He made it sound like taking on massive debt to fund someone else's secret lifestyle was some kind of noble sacrifice that previous generations would have made without question. The meeting lasted over 3 hours, and by the end, I felt like I'd been emotionally beaten with a sledgehammer. Every person in that room had decided that I was selfish, ungrateful, and failing in my duties as a son. The fact that I'd already contributed more than everyone else combined meant nothing. The fact that Mom had been deceiving me for years meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was that there was a financial problem, and I was the designated solution. As everyone was leaving, Jessica pulled me aside for one final guilt trip. She told me that she was ashamed to call me her brother, and that she hoped I could live with myself knowing that I'd turned my back on family when they needed me most. She said Mom would probably lose a house because of my selfishness, and it would be my fault when she ended up homeless. Mark's parting shot was even better. He suggested that maybe I should think about what kind of person I'd become and whether my priorities were in the right place. This coming from a guy who'd spent more on his truck payment than he'd ever contributed to any family expense. But apparently self-awareness wasn't his strong suit. Driving home that night, I realized that I wasn't just dealing with Mom's financial crisis anymore. I was dealing with an entire family system that had decided I was a problem, and that my only value was as a source of money to solve other people's issues. The people I'd grown up with, the people I'd trusted and loved, had collectively decided that my feelings, my financial future, and my right to make my own decisions didn't matter. That was the night I started to understand that sometimes the biggest betrayals come from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. If I thought the family meeting was bad, I had no idea what was coming next. Mom didn't just accept my decision to step back from her financial crisis. She declared war, and her weapon of choice was the court of public opinion. It started subtly at first. A few cousins began texting me with concerned messages, asking if everything was okay between Mom and me. They'd heard through the family grapevine that there was some kind of disagreement, and they wanted to make sure I was doing all right. At first, I thought maybe some family members were actually going to be understanding about the situation. Boy, was I wrong. Within a week, Mom had launched a full-scale social media campaign designed to paint me as the worst son in America. Her Facebook posts were masterpieces of emotional manipulation, carefully crafted to generate maximum sympathy while making me look like a complete monster. The first post was about the struggles of being a single mother and how difficult it was when your children grow up and forget about all the sacrifices you made for them. It got 43 likes and dozens of supportive comments from family friends who had no idea what was actually happening behind the scenes. Then came the post about financial hardship and the fear of losing the family home. She wrote about sleepless nights worrying about the future and how heartbreaking it was to realize that the people you thought you could count on weren't there when you needed them most. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone who knew our family understood exactly who she was talking about. The comment section became a therapy session for every person who'd ever felt abandoned by their adult children. People were sharing their own stories about ungrateful kids and offering Mom emotional support while simultaneously condemning whoever had put her in this position. It was like watching a virtual lynch mob form in real time. But Mom's social media campaign was just the beginning. She started making phone calls to extended family members, church friends, and even some of my old high school buddies who were still connected to her through social media. Each conversation was apparently a tear-filled account of how her son had abandoned her in her darkest hour. My phone started ringing constantly. Cousin Sarah called to express her disappointment and ask how I could live with myself. My old buddy Jake from high school sent me a message saying he'd always looked up to me but was shocked to hear about how I was treating my mother. Even Mrs. Henderson from next door, who'd known me since I was 10 years old, gave me a cold shoulder when I ran into her at the grocery store. The worst part was that Mom had gotten really good at telling just enough truth to make her story believable while leaving out all the important context. She talked about the years I'd helped with payments, but framed it like I'd suddenly stopped for no reason. She mentioned the debt crisis, but made it sound like it was due to unexpected medical expenses or home repairs rather than funding a secret relationship. Every person who called me had heard the same basic story. Devoted mother faces financial crisis. Ungrateful son refuses to help despite having the means to do so. Nobody had heard about Tyler, about the luxury spending, about the emails, or about the years of deception. Mom had become the victim, and I was the villain who'd heartlessly abandoned family when things got tough. The social pressure became overwhelming. I couldn't go to the grocery store, the gas station, or even the gym without running into someone who'd heard Mom's version of events. The looks I got ranged from disappointment to outright disgust. People who'd known me my entire life were treating me like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. My co-workers started acting weird around me too. Apparently, Mom had reached out to some of them through mutual connections, sharing her story and asking them to help her understand why her son had changed so dramatically. The office dynamics became incredibly uncomfortable as people tried to figure out how to interact with someone they now saw as a heartless family abandoner. The breaking point came when Mom showed up at my apartment complex and started talking to my neighbors. Mrs. Patterson from downstairs knocked on my door the next evening with a casserole and a concerned expression. She wanted to make sure I understood how much my mother was suffering and suggested that maybe I should reconsider my decision to cut off financial support. It turned out Mom had spent over an hour in the courtyard, crying and telling anyone who would listen about her situation. She'd painted herself as this desperate woman whose only son had turned his back on her despite her years of sacrifice and devotion. By the time she left, half the complex probably thought I was some kind of sociopath. The manipulation campaign reached its peak when Mom started involving my workplace directly. She called my boss, pretending to be concerned about my mental health, and suggesting that I might be going through some kind of personal crisis that was affecting my judgment. She asked him to keep an eye on me and to let her know if he noticed any changes in my behavior or performance. My boss, being a decent guy, pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay at home. He mentioned that my mother had called and seemed very worried about me. The conversation was awkward and humiliating, especially since I had to explain that my mother was basically stalking me because I refused to take on her debt obligations. But the most devastating part of Mom's campaign was how effectively she'd turned the entire family narrative upside down. In her version of events, I wasn't the son who'd been financially supporting her for years only to discover he'd been funding her secret relationship. I was the selfish child who'd abandoned his struggling mother in her time of greatest need. She'd managed to erase 3 years of monthly payments, countless emergency contributions, and all the sacrifices I'd made to help her. Instead, she created this alternative reality where I was some kind of cold, calculating person who'd suddenly decided to stop caring about family for no apparent reason. The worst part was watching family members who knew better choose to go along with Mom's narrative rather than deal with the uncomfortable truth. Jessica and Mark both knew exactly how much I contributed over the years, but they found it easier to support Mom's victim story than to acknowledge their own lack of contribution or to deal with the complexity of the Tyler situation. Even extended family members who'd witnessed my years of support somehow developed selective amnesia when it came time to choose sides. It was easier to believe that I'd suddenly become heartless than to accept that Mom had been systematically deceiving everyone while manipulating her children's emotions for financial gain. The isolation was crushing. Every family gathering, every social event, every interaction with anyone connected to our family became an exercise in damage control. I found myself constantly defending decisions that shouldn't have needed defending and explaining situations that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. After months of this treatment, I started to understand something important about family dynamics. Sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as the story people want to believe. Sometimes being right isn't enough when everyone around you has decided you're wrong. And sometimes the people who claim to love you unconditionally are the first ones to abandon you when supporting you becomes inconvenient for them. The smear campaign had accomplished exactly what Mom intended. I was completely isolated from family support, socially ostracized in my community, and emotionally exhausted from constantly having to justify my decision to stop funding someone else's deceptive lifestyle. She'd turned my refusal to be manipulated into evidence of my moral failure, and apparently that was a story everyone was ready to believe. After months of being treated like a pariah by my own family and half my community, I reached a breaking point that probably saved my sanity and my future. It happened on a Tuesday evening when I was sitting in my apartment, staring at yet another guilt-tripped text message from Jessica about Mom's latest crisis. Something about reading that text just flipped a switch in my brain. I'd spent months defending myself, explaining the situation, and try and make people understand the truth about Tyler and the financial deception. But nobody wanted to hear it because the truth was complicated and uncomfortable, while Mom's victim narrative was simple and emotionally satisfying. I realized I'd been playing a game where the rules were rigged against me from the start. No matter how much evidence I provided, no matter how clearly I explained the timeline of events, I was always going to be cast as the villain because that's the role the family needed me to play. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was done explaining myself, done defending my choices, done trying to maintain relationships with people who saw me only as a source of money and emotional labor. I started by blocking Mom's number and all her social media accounts. Then I did the same with Jessica and Mark. Uncle Dave got blocked too, along with every family member who participated in the guilt campaign, or who'd chosen to believe obvious lies rather than deal with uncomfortable truths. The silence was incredible. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't constantly buzzing with manipulative messages, guilt trips, or updates about Mom's latest dramatic crisis. I could go through an entire day without someone trying to make me feel terrible about decisions that were actually reasonable and necessary. But the real transformation happened when I stopped paying Mom's mortgage entirely. I'd been continuing to make partial payments even after everything that had happened, partly out of habit and partly because the guilt campaign had been somewhat effective. But once I cut off all contact, it became clear that continuing to send money was just enabling the dysfunction. Within a week of stopping the payments, my monthly budget had breathing room I hadn't experienced in years. That $1,500 suddenly became available for my own life, my own goals, my own future. The psychological relief was even more dramatic than the financial relief. I didn't wake up every morning wondering what family crisis would hit my phone, what new guilt trip would be waiting in my messages, or what community member had been recruited into Mom's victim narrative. The constant stress and anxiety that had become my normal state started to fade away. Of course, the family didn't take my boundaries well. When they realized I wasn't responding to calls, texts, or social media attempts, they escalated to showing up at my apartment and my workplace. Jessica made several trips from Denver, apparently convinced that if she could just talk to me face-to-face, she could guilt me back into compliance. I refused to engage. When family members showed up at my door, I didn't answer. When they tried to intercept me at work, I walked past them without acknowledgement. When they sent mutual friends to intervene, I politely declined to discuss family matters and changed the subject. The community pressure continued for a while, but it gradually lost momentum when people realized I wasn't on crack. Mom's social media posts became increasingly desperate and unhinged as the financial reality set in. The most surprising development came about 6 months after I'd cut all contact. I learned through mutual acquaintances that Tyler had actually returned to the picture, apparently having resolved whatever issues had caused him to disappear initially. He and Mom were apparently working together to manage the financial situation, which confirmed my suspicion that his earlier absence had been strategic rather than permanent. Even better, I heard that Mom had started working full-time for the first time in years and had developed a realistic budget for dealing with her debts. Apparently, when the guaranteed monthly payment from her son disappeared, she'd been forced to take actual responsibility for her financial situation. The transformation in my own life was remarkable. Without the constant drain of family drama and financial obligation, I was able to focus on my career, my relationships, and my personal goals. I got promoted at work, started dating someone amazing who had healthy family relationships, and began planning for a future that belonged entirely to me. Most importantly, I learned to recognize the difference between genuine family support and emotional manipulation disguised as love. Real family doesn't demand that you sacrifice your financial security to fund their lifestyle choices. Real family doesn't launch smear campaigns when you set reasonable boundaries. Looking back now, I can see that cutting ties with my toxic family was one of the best decisions I ever made. It was painful, especially initially, but it opened up space in my life for relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation and emotional manipulation. I've built a chosen family of friends and partners who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. I've learned to trust my own judgment instead of constantly second-guessing myself based on other people's guilt trips. The house eventually went into foreclosure, but Mom and Tyler found a rental that worked for their budget. Jessica and Mark apparently had to contribute some money after all, though nowhere near the amounts they'd expected me to cover. The family dynamic shifted, but it shifted without me, which was exactly the outcome I'd hoped for. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh, if there might have been some middle ground that preserved family relationships while maintaining my boundaries. But then I remember the emails I found, the months of manipulation, and a complete lack of respect for my contributions and sacrifices over the years. To anyone else dealing with family members who see you primarily as an ATM or emotional dumping ground, I want you to know that it's okay to walk away. It's okay to protect your own financial future and mental health. It's okay to refuse to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, even when those people share your DNA and claim to love you. Family isn't about biology or obligation. It's about mutual respect, genuine care, and support that flows in both directions. If your family relationships are one-sided, manipulative, or destructive to your well-being, you have permission to step away and build something better for yourself. The guilt will fade, the pressure will decrease, and the relief will be life-changing. Trust me on this one. What do you think about this story? Has anyone else dealt with family members who turned out to be more interested in your wallet than your well-being? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing for more real-life stories like this one. Your support means everything and helps me keep sharing these experiences with people who might be going through similar situations. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save your life.